Chapter 8. We weren't the first wrestlers to switch promotions in Japan, and we wouldn't be the last. A few years before we jumped, Abdullah the Butcher, who at that time was probably the top heel in all Japan, appeared on a New Japan card. That same year, Stan Hansen jumped from New Japan to All Japan. But it was after we made the switch, that I would say rivalry between the two promotions began to heat up. As always in wrestling, it came down to money. Baba was building his promotion up to compete with New Japan, and he was prepared to pay for the wrestlers who could do the job. So when Hadachi opened that briefcase and offered us the money, I said yeah, straight away. The deal was this. Baba would pay us $20,000 each, up front, $10,000 straight away if we signed a contract, and $10,000 when we got to Japan. After that we'd be paid $6,200 for every week of the tour, which was $1,000 a week more than Inoki was paying us. Not only that, Baba would let us pick the tours we wanted to do, we could have done the lot. So I signed the contract, and although he was scared shitless about what we were doing, Davey Boy Smith signed his. Our first tour for All Japan would be in November, at the annual tag team tournament, but there was one problem: officially, I was still the world champion for New Japan. And they were expecting me to give George Takano a rematch for the title when we went back. So for the next few weeks we had to keep everything quiet, we didn't tell anybody. We flew to Tokyo, the idea being that we'd lie low for a week in a secret location to keep us out of the way and, I imagine, make our appearance for All Japan a bigger surprise. Baba sent someone to meet us at the airport and they took us to a hotel somewhere in Tokyo. Hadachi was waiting for us at the hotel, with enough money to see us through the week, 50,000 yen for me, and 50,000 yen for Davey. But Hadachi wouldn't give it to us all at once, he dished it out, a little bit every day. And he stayed at the hotel, I imagine to make sure we didn't do anything stupid. I decided not to be ignorant about the World Championship belt that I still had. I packed it in a box, put a note in which said, "Thank you very much, Dynamite Kid," and sent it back to the New Japan office in Tokyo. I didn't have to, I could have kept it. I know a lot of other wrestlers would have kept it. But I thought sending it back was the polite thing to do. Plus, I could now say I'd retired undefeated. On our first day with All Japan, we turned up at the hotel where all the other American wrestlers were staying for the new tour. And as we walked through the door, who should we see but Baba, sitting at one side of a table in the lounge, smoking one of his big cigars, and, on the other side of the table, Seiji Sakaguchi. They were obviously talking about us. Well, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting that, but I carried on walking, looking casual. And Davey Boy Smith, who was nearly filling his pants, hid behind me, hid as if he thought Sakaguchi wouldn't see him. He said, "Tommy, we're going to get in trouble." I told him to shut up. We'd made the jump, signed the contract, I'd sent the belt back. That was it. If Sakaguchi had bad words to say about us, I could say a few bad words back. But Sakaguchi didn't say anything. In fact, he didn't even look at us, because he was in serious discussion with Baba. We found out later that they'd come to some sort of agreement, because somehow, probably because of that belt, we were officially still tied to New Japan. I imagine Baba gave Inoki some financial compensation, and he agreed to black out any media coverage, because New Japan didn't want anybody to find out what we'd done. At least not yet. That didn't bother me, because we were getting paid. And I didn't feel guilty about what we'd done, because I know for a fact that any wrestler in the same position, offered the same deal, would have done exactly the same. I heard that Sakaguchi took it very badly. It was about 6 months later when I saw him in Madison Square Garden in New York, the first time I'd seen him since we'd left New Japan. He put his hand out, shook my hand, and said, "No hard feelings." That was it. And a few years after that I ran into Antonio Inoki at Tokyo Airport. I shouted to him, "Antonio." He turned round, saw me and gave me a big smile. We shook hands, and that was that. And I was glad I had the chance to do that. Inoki, Sakaguchi, Fujinami, Choshu, these were men who I liked and respected, and who I like to think respected me. In the end everything was okay between us. But not in 1984. As part of the media blackout, our first match was filmed but never shown on TV. Which was a shame because it was a great match, myself and Davey Boy Smith against Terry and Dory Funk Jr. in the Karakeen Hall in Tokyo. It ended in a double countout, with me and Terry outside the ring. I was trying to crawl back in the ring, but Terry kept hold of my leg and wouldn't let me get in. As wrestlers, the Funks were fantastic, and in my opinion, probably had the greatest wrestling brains in the ring. That was the first time I'd met Terry Funk, in the hotel in Tokyo. I remember the first words he ever said to me. "Dynamite, I think I've got a job for you. Can you speak Russian?" Straight away I said, "Yeah. Nastrovia." He said, "Okay, I think you've got the job." Then he started telling me how he was a very good friend of Sylvester Stallone, who, at that time, was making another Rocky film with Dolph Lundgren. Stallone was looking for somebody who could speak Russian. "And he wants somebody who can box," said Terry. "I think you're the man." So I said, "Okay, when is it?" "In a few months, Dynamite. I'll let you know." 6 months later, the film came out at the cinema, and the next time I saw him I said, "Terry, what happened? How come I didn't get the part with Sylvester Stallone?" He said, "Well, Dino," he always called me Dino. "There's been a bit of a mistake." "What do you mean, Terry, a mistake?" "You're too short." We had some great laughs over the years, mainly because Terry was always messing about and acting the loony. And he is one of the greatest wrestlers I've ever been in the ring with. All the years I wrestled, I took pride in giving every single opponent a good match. It didn't matter how pathetic or useless they were, I never let anybody look bad. Never. But you know what, Terry was better at it better than me. He took the weakest chops and the worst clotheslines, then he'd bounce round the ring, and flop about on his back like a fish out of water. He could wrestle a broomstick and made it look like $1 million. That's how good he was. I remember a match he had with the Native American, Steve Gator Wolf. He was a waste of time, always bullshitting about how great he was, and then just before the match he'd get so nervous he couldn't speak. Against Terry Funk, he got in the ring and froze. He couldn't move. And when he finally managed a feeble tomahawk chop, Terry looked as if he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. He was fantastic. And, he was a terrible joker. Nearly as bad as me. But I couldn't think of a better way to kick off a tour than a tag match with the Funks, televised or not. Meanwhile, Sayama, who hadn't wrestled in nearly a year since he left New Japan, appeared on a card at the Karakeen Hall, wrestling for a new promotion called the Youth. I'd known about this for a while because he called me while I was still with New Japan to tell me about it. "It's a different promotion," he said, "no backdrops, we don't hit the ropes. Just shooting style." What he really wanted was for me to join the Youth with him, so I said I'd think about it, and I did, but I decided not to go. I thought to myself, these men, Sayama, Maeda, Takada, if they go ahead with it, what happens if it goes wrong and nobody turns up? In my opinion, with that style of wrestling, it was a gamble. So I decided to stay put with Inoki. Sayama called me a few times after that, trying to make me to change my mind, and I think he was a bit upset that I said no. And the bad feeling that I had about it, was proved correct, because the Youth, the first Youth, did close down. Which was a real shame, because they were all very good wrestlers, all hard workers. I'd known Nobuhiko Takeda since he was a young boy, and in my opinion he was always trying to do more than he could. But he had a big heart and I admired him for that. Anyway, with all the hassle of switching promotions behind us, we finished our first tour for Baba thinking we'd done the right thing. The fans enjoyed our matches, they got their money's worth and so did Baba. And of course Hadarchi took all the credit for bringing us to All Japan. Baba's wife, Motoko, who always went to the matches, thanked him personally, because, and I don't mind saying it, we were a good tag team. But going to All Japan was nothing to do with Hadarchi. It was Baba's money that got us there, nothing and nobody else. But it was time to head home to Calgary. To another load of trouble. Stu Hart was mad, probably madder than I'd ever seen him. What the fuck did you two think you were doing going to All Japan? So I told him. Well Stu, that's my prerogative, which he probably didn't understand, plus I'm on $1,000 a week more, plus I've done my time for all those Japanese wrestlers in New Japan, plus I've got a schedule -1 can pick any tour I want. He said, well you just cost me, you little bastard. That was when he told me that Inoki had been paying him, about $10,000 a tour, to let us go to Japan. It was news to me, but I could understand why he was so mad. I was mad -1 thought we should have had a share. Bret was even more upset. He was upset because I went without him. As things turned out, Bret Hart didn't have time to sit around feeling sorry for himself, the WWF was in town. George Scott, who at that time was Vince McMahon's right-hand man, turned up at the pavilion to see the Friday night TV taping. He took one look at me, bear in mind, I'd just come back from Japan, where I'd start out clean-shaven, including my head, but after 4 weeks, looked more like Robinson Crusoe, and he said, you'll have to shave that lot off you know. He watched the matches -1 was wrestling Bret, and afterward he asked us both if we would go to New York for a WWF TV taping. It sounded great, because even then, in 1984, the WWF was on a much bigger scale than Stampede, we were about to make ourselves some serious money. We had to go to Poughkeepsie, in upstate New York, where, at that time, the WWF did most of its TV tapings. I walked into the dressing room, and the first person I spotted was my old friend Sylvester Ritter, the Junkyard Dog. He took one look at me, and if he could have, he would have turned white. I walked straight up to him and said, right you bastard, where's my money? The last time I'd seen Junkyard must have been 4 or 5 years ago in Calgary. Back then he was Big Daddy Ritter and we were tag partners. He decided that we should have matching ring gowns, and said he knew a place in Calgary where he could get them made. So I gave him $1,000 and the last thing he said to me was that they'd be ready the next Monday. Monday came, no word from Junkyard Dog. I went round to his apartment, but it was empty, literally. He'd cleared out. I went down to the shop where the gowns were being made, and found it closed down. Junkyard Dog had gone, and taken my $1,000 with him. I thought that was it, until I walked into the dressing room in Poughkeepsie. Well, he was full of apologies and excuses, and promises that he was going to pay me back, which he did, eventually, although I should have charged him interest. But to tell you the truth, I was glad to see Junkyard Dog again. But apart from that, our first appearance for the WWF went okay. And luckily for us, the place was sold out. I knew the wrestlers were paid according to business on the night, and as I looked around I thought to myself, we'll be all right here. We wrestled a tag match, then singles matches against a couple of job boys. We got changed and waited for our windfall. Arnold Scarland was in charge of the money and paying the wrestlers. He handed us our pay, $25 each. I looked at it and I said, I'm not being funny Arnold, but where's the rest of it? He said, that's it. $25 apiece. There had to be a mistake. I said, you mean we've traveled 3,000 miles to wrestle for $25? Arnold, we didn't bring much money with us. I kept on at him until in the end he said, what it is Dynamite, is this. You're getting the publicity. Do you know how many people will see you wrestle on TV? Which didn't make me feel any better because $25 for 2 matches was, to me, still a rip-off. And worse than that, the job boys were getting $200. So that night, me and Brett had to find a cheap hotel before making it back to Calgary with about $5 between us. The next day I went straight to Stu and told him to call Vince McMahon. You can tell him we are never going back again. I meant it. I didn't care because I still had Japan, and I could wrestle for Baba all year if I wanted to. But George Scott called again and asked us back to do a few spot shows, which are small house shows, on the New York Loop. And he told us that we'd get more money for a house show, at least a proportion of what was in the building on the night. So me and Brett did go back, and for a week of spot shows on the New York Loop, we made about $5,000. That year saw massive changes to wrestling in the United States. Vince McMahon Sr. had died and his son, Vince Jr., was running the WWF. And he had big plans for the company, like a coast-to-coast monopoly on the wrestling business. They took all the top names from the different territories, places like Portland, Minneapolis, Louisiana, put the television in, and took over the business. Stampede Wrestling was no different, and when Vince McMahon made Stu an offer, he took it. When Stu told us that Stampede was closing, it didn't mean a lot to me. I knew I was okay because I had Japan, but I did feel sorry for the other wrestlers who were suddenly out of work. Vince didn't want them all. He signed Brett up straight away, and Jim Neidhart shortly afterward, and I knew he wanted to bring me in as well. The problem with the WWF was that the money was never guaranteed, and I had a mortgage to pay and a family to look after. In Japan, I knew exactly how much I could earn. On the other hand, the WWF was already the biggest promotion in America, and about to get even bigger. So when they called again from the WWF to arrange a meeting, I said I was interested. And, because I knew we were a good tag team, I told them about my cousin, Davey Boy Smith. They flew us to Toronto for a meeting with Vince McMahon and George Scott. We were in a press conference room at the Howard Johnson Hotel by the airport where we sat and talked for about half an hour. Vince was friendly, and what he seemed most interested in was the fact that me and Davey Boy Smith were first cousins and that we were British. It was during that meeting that he came up with the idea of the British Bulldogs. He laughed and said, well, you look like a pair of bulldogs. And if I think about it, what with the steroids, and our mean-looking faces, I suppose we did. Anyway, after the small talk, Vince got serious. He said, well, what do you think? Do you want to come along or not? I looked at Davey and said, what do you want to do? Well, as I expected, he never even opened his mouth, so I said to Vince, okay. We'll give it a try. That was really the first time I met Vince McMahon. I met him many times after that, usually after I'd done something wrong, or he mistakenly thought I'd done something wrong. For example, somebody shaved some bald patches in George Scott's son's hair while he was asleep, and although it could have been any one of 20 wrestlers who'd done it, George thought it was me. We might have an afternoon match in New York City, and an evening match in Hartford, Connecticut, about 50 miles away. There'd be a message for me at the hotel saying call in at the Stamford office on your way to Hartford. Vince wants to see you. But even if he was mad, Vince never let it show. He never raised his voice. We'd be in his office, sitting in front of his desk, with Davey Boy trying to hide behind me, and Vince would say, calmly, Tom, I know it was you that did it. And I'd look at him, all innocent, and say, Vince, there were 20 other wrestlers in that dressing room. How come you always blame the Bulldogs? But he was right. Most of the time it was me, but I couldn't admit it then or he would have fired me. But anyway, on that first night as the British Bulldogs, at a TV taping in Poughkeepsie, we set out to be on our best behavior. We were wearing our brand new Union Jack outfits, and if I say so myself, we looked great. Pat Patterson was the road agent in charge on this night, and when it was time for our match he said to us, "Boys, pure lease, when you get in that ring I want you to bark like a couple of bulldogs." So we did. We ran down the aisle, climbed through the ropes, and crawled round the ring on all fours, and shouted, "Bowsy wowsy, bowsy wowsy." The audience saw the funny side of it, but for some reason, Pat Patterson didn't. In fact, I'll be honest, we nearly got fired on our first night. It was George Scott who asked us to sign a contract during one TV pre-taping. He handed me a piece of paper, which he said was a 5-year contract, and asked me to sign it there and then. What it meant was no more Japan, no working for anybody except the WWF. So I said no, and gave him the contract back. I know the majority of wrestlers were under a contract of some kind, but not the Bulldogs. I needed to know that I had Japan as an option if I wanted it. So we never signed one. For a while, we had the best of both worlds. In between bookings for the WWF, we did a couple of tours for Baba. Just as he promised, Baba paid us $20,000 up front at the beginning of the year, and I guarantee every week that we were on tour. All Japan had a stronger tag team division than New Japan, but never seemed to push the idea of a junior heavyweight division. They had given the Tiger Mask gimmick to a young wrestler by the name of Mitsuhara Misawa, in the hope that he would do the same business for them that Sayama had done for New Japan. How did Misawa's Tiger Mask compare to Sayama's? It didn't. Don't get me wrong, Misawa was a great wrestler, but in my opinion, he was too tall and too heavy to be Tiger Mask, and nowhere near as agile as Sayama. He couldn't hope to follow in his footsteps in the ring. No spin kicks, no back somersaults, no moonsaults, but I'll give him credit, he was a hard worker. One of the first matches I had with him was a 6-man tag, with him on our team. Before the match started I heard him say something to Toshiaki Kawada, who was on the other team, maybe complaining a bit, because Kawada said "Dosh Tano," or "What's the matter?" I think, even though he had the mask on, Misawa didn't want to be seen in the ring with us. To be honest, I don't think he liked me, and he was having a bit of a sulk. Which was no big deal because he ended up winning that one for us anyway. We had some singles matches as well, and while I'm sure they were enjoyed by the fans, for me, they were nowhere near as exciting as Sayama's. I wrestled him in Sapporo one night where the stipulation was, if he won, he would move up to the heavyweight division. So I took him from the top rope to the concrete with a side salter, a type of suplex, and the result was a double countout, so he stayed put. I had a lot of matches with Tiger Mask too, in later years some very hard matches, because in a lot of ways, Misawa was like me, when he hit, you had to be ready for it. Around the same time we made the switch to All Japan, a tide of wrestlers from New Japan did the same, including Riki Choshu, Animal Higuchi, Isamu Teranishi, and Yoshiaki Yatsu. To be honest, Baba had too many wrestlers on his hands, but I know he still paid them even when he couldn't book them. That was what I always liked about Japanese promoters. When it came to money, you could trust them because they were men of their word. That's not to say Vince McMahon wasn't. But working for the WWF didn't have the same security. Your wage depended entirely on business, and on where you wrestled on the card. For example, if you were in the first match on a spot show, you might get $200. Second match, you get $300, and so on, up to the main event where you could get $2,000. But if you were in the first match at Madison Square Garden, you could get $1,000, while the main event men like Hogan went home with $10,000, maybe more, for a sold-out arena. But even that could change from one night to the next, so you never knew how much you were going to get paid. When the WWF really started to expand across the country, they had TV shows going out to just about every town and city in the United States. Once the TV was established and the interest was growing, they ran house shows in every town and city in the United States. But because there were so many venues to cover, they'd often send a couple of teams of wrestlers out on separate tours. As you can imagine, if you were the first match on a spot show in Austin, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona, where there might have been only 3,000 people in the building, you'd be pissed off knowing that the other tour was doing 10,000 sellouts every night in places like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. But as always in wrestling, success doesn't happen overnight, and you could spend a long time getting beaten at the bottom of the card. Ask Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart. They had teamed up to form the Hart Foundation and they spent months getting beaten by the Rougeaus. Rick Rude was the same. When he came into the WWF he thought he was never going to win. He told me. But he stuck at it and look where he ended up, as the Intercontinental Champion. So you had to be patient. The British Bulldogs had a better time of it, because we were babyfaces, and, by comparison, we were a lot smaller than some of the other wrestlers. And it's easier to push the underdogs up the card. But for the first few months we were with the WWF, because of Japan, it was on a semi-regular basis. But that didn't stop us having some great matches when the right opponents came along, which was what happened when Terry and Dory Funk turned up in the WWF. Terry hadn't changed. He still liked to fool around. We had to catch a plane early one morning to the next venue. Terry got on and he was dragging his rucksack behind him. It looked as if it weighed a ton because he was heaving on the strap, his face was going purple and all the muscles and sinews on his arms were sticking out. So one of the stewardesses walked by and said, "Can I help you?" Terry was panting and out of breath, but he said, "No, I'll be okay." He finally got the bag to his seat and he started trying to lift it into the luggage compartment. He was struggling again, so the stewardess said, "Come on, let me help you." She bent down, lifted it up, and nearly fell over backward because it was empty, there was nothing in it. But, occasionally, the joke was on Terry. We were in Pittsburgh one night having a drink in the hotel after the match. It got to about 2 a.m., and although we had an early plane to catch the next day, Terry said, "Oh, come on, we'll have one more." So I got up and said, "It's okay, I'll get this. What do you want?" "Thanks, Dino. I'll have a brandy." While he wasn't looking, I slipped a yellow jacket, Speed, which a lot of wrestlers used to take to keep themselves awake, into his brandy. I handed him his drink and said, "Cheers, Terry." "Cheers, Dino." I didn't see Terry again until just before the match the next day. I walked into the dressing room and there was Terry, sitting on a bench with his head down. He looked up at me, he looked bloody awful, and he said, "Dino, don't do that again." "What? Don't do what, Terry? What are you talking about?" He said, "I've not been to sleep." I said, "Terry, I'm being serious. What are you talking about?" I think he believed me in the end, but anyway, Terry, yeah, it was me. Our last match with the Funks was in Buffalo, New York. Terry was having trouble with his knees, and right after the match, he said to his brother, "Dory, tell Dino I'm going home." Dory said, "You can't go home, we've got another 4 weeks yet." But Terry didn't care. He left, which I didn't blame him for. He never called Vince, never gave them any notice, and buggered off back to Texas. That was when they brought Jesse Barr in as Jimmy Jack Funk, the third Funk brother, and he was rotten, terrible. He thought he was great, but all I can say is, bless him for trying. As a team, The British Bulldogs were making progress in the WWF, although I felt it wasn't fast enough. We had some great matches against the Moondogs, who at that time were being managed by Mr. Fuji. Rex and Spot weren't the most agile of opponents, in fact, they could be hard work to maneuver in the ring. But they were good fun. At one TV taping we had to pretend we were taking tea with the Moondogs. We were being very British, drinking out of posh teacups and saucers and eating little sandwiches, and they had to behave like animals. We rehearsed this scene, and I said to Fuji, "Do me a favor. When we've eaten these sandwiches, and Spot starts acting stupid, hit him over the head with a plate." I didn't think he'd really do it, but he did. He picked up a plate, a real plate, said, "Hey Moondog-san." And then bang, he smashed it over Spot's head into little pieces. And it went out on TV. But there were a lot of frustrations as well. In the summer of 1985, Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda beat Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik to become tag team champions for the second time. They were babyfaces, which meant we couldn't go near the tag team belts. But a couple of months later they dropped the belts to Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake. Windham was leaving the WWF, so the team split, which should have made us the top contenders. But it wasn't as easy as that. We were messed around, told we could have title shots, but then told we weren't ready to be champions, even though we were the main event on the B Tour, and we were drawing. So I told Chief Jay Strongbow, one of Vince's road agents, I didn't want the belts anyway, and in November we were back in Japan for the All Japan Tag Tournament. All Japan was a much stronger promotion now. Jumbo Tsurata and Genkairo Tenryu were still the top men, but they had a lot of very talented younger wrestlers coming up, Misawa, Kawada, and one who I always thought was a fantastic wrestler, Kenta Kobashi. There were some great tag matches with Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody against Tenryu and Tsurata, and me and Davey against Misawa and Kobayashi, so standards shot up. A lot of wrestlers were scared of Frank Bruiser Brody, and maybe they had good reason to be, because he could use his fists. You may not believe this, but away from the ring Frank, bless him, was a gentleman, and always very good to me. There were a lot of American wrestlers on the cards, and while most of them did become popular with the Japanese fans, some of them had no idea what wrestling in Japan was all about. Jerry Lawler and Jimmy Valiant were booked on one tour, just for a week. I imagine it was the only week they ever did in Japan, for a simple reason. Their opponents, the Japanese wrestlers, refused to sell. Jerry would be in the ring with, for example, Killer Khan. Every time Jerry landed a shot, Killer stood there. He didn't move. So then Jimmy, who was on the apron, started shouting, "Mushi, Mushi," at the top of his voice. The stupid bastard didn't realize it means hello in Japanese, so the crowd started laughing at them. Back in the dressing room, they were talking to each other, trying to figure out what went wrong. I heard Jerry say to Jimmy, "I've had Killer Khan in Tennessee and he sells all my shots. Tonight he didn't move. I can't understand it." I thought to myself, I can. The reason they're not selling is because you're not hitting hard enough, plus, you're in their country. They're not going to be put down in Japan. Gypsy Joe was another American who we met in Tokyo. One night after the matches we were all going for something to eat. I said, "Gypsy, can you speak Japanese?" He said, "I speak fluent Japanese. You order and I will tell them what you want." Bear in mind, we were only in McDonald's in Tokyo, so I asked for a Filet-O-Fish and 2 Big Macs. Joe said to the young Japanese girl behind the counter, "2 Big Mac O, 1 Filet-O-Fish O." I thought to myself, that's not Japanese, anybody can say that. So I told Davy Boy Smith to pass me 2 paper napkins, rolled them up into little balls and stuffed them underneath the straps on the back of his jacket. And while Gypsy Joe was trying to talk to the girl, I got my cigarette lighter out and set the napkins on fire. Now I know this sounds like a bad joke, and it was, but believe me, it was funny at the time. The girl saw the smoke coming up from behind his jacket and started waving and pointing, but he kept saying, "No, no, listen. 2 Big Mac, oh, 1 Filet-O-Fish, oh." Well, he soon realized that he was on fire, and although he didn't get hurt, he was upset about what we'd done. He went straight back to the hotel and told Tiger Jeet Singh that the Bulldogs had set him on fire. Tiger Jeet Singh was probably the worst person he could have told, mainly because ever since we'd come into All Japan, he'd been looking to try and push us out. His tag partner for the tournament was Abdullah the Butcher, who was a very good friend of mine, and had always treated me well. Tiger on the other hand was a tight bastard, and as a wrestler, a load of shit, kicks, punches awful. The Japanese people liked his character, the way he ran in the ring with a sword between his teeth, but, marks out of 10 for wrestling, I'd give him 0. Tiger Jeet Singh liked his glory, and didn't like to lose. In a tag match, he made sure he never did. But, Baba had decided that the Bulldogs were ready to be pushed, and Abdullah and Tiger Jeet Singh were our next opponents. When Joe Higuchi told him the finish, Tiger said, "Oh no no no. I do no job for him, as in me, the Dynamite Kid." And on the night, he made sure it was Abdullah who was pinned. During that match Abdullah opened my head up and I bled all over the place. Tiger Jeet was up on the apron, and when he saw all the blood he started calling, "Butcher, Butcher, tag me, tag me." You know why, don't you? I was down on my hands and knees, a bit groggy, and he'd come in and kick me in the head. Well, there were photographers all around that ring and he knew it would make a terrific picture for the wrestling magazines, me on the floor covered in blood, and him looking like $1 million for doing nothing. But he soon tagged Abdullah back in for the finish, because there was no way he was going to let me pin him. The prick. Anyway, the night that Gypsy Joe grassed me up, I think if he could have done, Tiger Jeet Singh would definitely have got me fired. He reported me to Joe Higuchi, but luckily for me, Gypsy Joe had seen the funny side of it as well and told him it was just a prank. So that was that. On one tour we were surprised to run into Giant Haystacks again. It was his first time in Japan, and he was probably feeling a little bit nervous, and so I wasn't surprised that he came to me for advice. He said, "Tommy, how do you wrestle these Japanese men?" I said, "Hard, Haystacks, very hard. When your man goes down, grab hold of his hair and yank him up." He looked at me in surprise. I said, "Really, you have to pull them up by their hair? It has to look good. This is Japan, you know." Haystacks nodded and said, "Right." I said, "And when you hit him, make sure you hit him." So Haystacks went off to the ring for his first match in Japan, which was against a wrestler called Kojika. And Haystacks listened to everything I had told him, and he knocked the shit out of Kojika, who weighed about 180 pounds, before beating him with his big elbow drop. They came back to the dressing room, and Haystacks sat there on a bench, puffing and panting. Kojika walked straight up to him and said, "You want to play monkey business?" And smacked Haystacks straight across the face, a real crack, you could almost feel it yourself. What do you think Haystacks did? Nothing. He just sat there and more or less let him do it. After 2 weeks of that tour, Haystacks had had enough. He went to Joe Higuchi and said, "I want to go home." But the All Japan office held his passport, and there was no way he was leaving before the 4 weeks were up. Haystacks was miserable. On the last night of the tour, it was Haystacks and Tiger Jeet Singh against Baba, and another Japanese wrestler. After 10 or 15 minutes, Haystacks was on the end of Baba's famous chops, and a minute later was pouring with blood. So Haystacks grabbed Baba from behind and held him while Tiger went in his trunks for a knuckle duster. He went to throw it at Baba's face, but he put his head forward, and Tiger nailed Haystacks instead. When Haystacks hit the mat, Baba crawled over and pinned him. 1, 2, 3. Haystacks had finally got it. Without really trying, he made Baba look great that night. 6 months later, when I was in the UK for a week to see my family, I made it a working holiday and did a couple of matches with Marty Jones. Haystacks was on the same card, and after the match when we were all in the dressing room, I shouted, "Haystacks, what did you think about Japan?" He looked at me and said, "Fuck off." Then he turned round to the other wrestlers and said, "This little bastard almost got me killed over there by the mafia." There were rumors that Kojika's family had some connections with the Yakuza, but funnily enough, Haystacks never mentioned the slapping. It was coming up to the end of the year, and just before we left to go home, I asked Joe Higuchi for our $20,000 guarantee for the following year. Joe said, "Baba says he will pay you next time you come back." I thought it seemed a bit funny, but I knew Baba always paid what he said he would. More or less as soon as we got home, the WWF wanted us back again. Which was great, knackering from the travel point of view, but great for the money we were making. We did a couple of weeks, Detroit, Pennsylvania, New York, and some of the smaller towns like Albany and Syracuse. And then one night, we were in the Joe Frazier Stadium in Chicago, when Chief Jay Strongbow told us, again, that we were in line for the title shot against Valentine and Beefcake at WrestleMania 11. But only a title shot. Well, I knew what that meant. And even though WrestleMania was going to be a big show, a pay-per-view event with a big paycheck for us, I said, "No, thank you very much, but when we've finished this tour, we'll be going back to Japan." Chief Jay couldn't believe I'd said that. He got up and left the dressing room, I think, to make a call to Vince, because a couple of minutes later he was back. He said, "Okay. You've got it. But that's it. You finish with Japan." Which I thought was fair enough. They had to build us up over the next few months to be ready for WrestleMania N in April. And I understood why Baba wouldn't give us our money in advance for the next year. He knew we weren't coming back.